Welcome to the Tobacco Online Policy Seminar TOPS. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Justin White, a tobacco control researcher at the University of California, San Francisco. TOPS is being organized by myself, Catherine McLean from Temple University, C. Shang from The Ohio State University, and Mike Pesco from Georgia State University. Today, we have a special panel discussion on conflicts of interest in tobacco research. The discussion will be 1 hour, led by the moderator. The audience may pose questions in the Q&A panel. Time permitting, the moderator will draw from these questions in conversation with our two panelists. Please review the guidelines on tobaccopolicy.org for acceptable comments. Please keep the comments professional and related to the topics being discussed. Comments meeting seminar series guidelines will be shared with the moderator and panelists afterwards, even if they're not read aloud. Your comments are very much appreciated. The presentation is being video recorded and will be made available on the TOPS website, tobaccopolicy.org. I will now introduce our distinguished moderator and panelists. Our moderator today is Dr. Neal Benowitz, Professor Emeritus and a clinical pharmacologist at the University of California, San Francisco. His research interests have focused primarily on the human pharmacology and toxicology of nicotine. He's published more than 700 research papers, edited 2 US Surgeon General's reports, served as a member of the FDA Tobacco Products Scientific Advisory Committee, and as past president of the Society for Research on Nicotine and Tobacco. Our first panelist is Dr. Joanna Cohen, the Bloomberg Professor of Disease Prevention and the Director of the Institute for Global Tobacco Control at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. She's been involved in tobacco policy research for over 25 years and has had a longstanding interest in the links between the tobacco industry and academia. She's deputy editor of the journal Tobacco Control and a former member of the FDA Tobacco Products Scientific Advisory Committee. Our second panelist is Dr. Michael Cummings, professor and a behavioral scientist and co-leader of the tobacco research program at the Hollings Cancer Center located at the Medical University of South Carolina. Over his 40-year career, he's published over 540 scientific papers and has contributed both as a reviewer and contributor to many US Surgeon General's reports. His research focuses on smoking cessation, consumer risk perceptions, and the evaluation of public policies on tobacco use behaviors. He's one of the co-founders of the International Tobacco Control Policy Evaluation Project, known as the ITC Project. Dr. Cummings was involved in helping to digitize millions of pages of previously secret tobacco industry documents and has testified as an expert witness on behalf of plaintiffs in over 200 cases against cigarette companies. He served as deputy editor of the journal Tobacco Control for nearly a decade and serves as an editor on several public health and cancer research journals today. Dr. Benowitz, I turn the floor over to you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Justin, and the other organizers for putting together this very timely webinar. We'd like to first start with having myself and the others discuss our conflicts of interest. So if you can show the slides. So my potential conflicts or disclosures is that I have been and am a consultant to pharmaceutical companies that market or are developing smoking cessation medications. I have been and continue to be a paid expert witness in litigation against tobacco companies. I have research funding from the NIH, from the California Tobacco-Related Disease Prevention Program, and I had funding from the Flight Attendants Medical Research Institute, which was funded from tobacco litigation. And I've served on scientific advisory committees for the FDA, the NIH, and have received funding and have been an advisor to NIH FDA-funded research programs, and have served on the editorial board of several journals. Next for Joanna.
Great, so I've just listed the grant funding that I've had since 2010. So funding from Bloomberg Philanthropies, NIH and other federal government agencies, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, FAMRI, university sources, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and Health Canada, the Ontario government, and I have a professorship endowment fund that I have access to. And I'll just say I've never done any work for, received any payments or reimbursements from, or had any type of relationship with any tobacco or pharmaceutical company or other commercial determinant of health.
Thanks, Joanna. And then Mike.
Sure. I'm a professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the Medical University of South Carolina. I also co-lead the Hollings Cancer Center Tobacco Research Program with Matt Carpenter. I've had NIH funding now since 1983. Hopefully it'll continue to be continuous. I've served on many scientific advisory committees for NIH funded grants. I served as an academic editor on several scientific journals. I'm a paid expert. I've made a lot of money in the last 25 years in litigation against cigarette manufacturers. And every time I go into court, as Neal probably knows, having done this himself, you have to disclose everything. So I'm all for disclosure. On the record, I think the world would be better off with cigarettes. I think cigarette manufacturers should be held accountable for the injuries they've caused. And I believe in the potential of smoking harm reduction, which I think is sort of the genesis for why we talk about disclosure these days. I have never taken money from a cigarette company, although they do have to pay me for depositions. So their lawyers are required to do that. And I happily accept their money because it increases the cost of cigarettes. But I have no problem talking with cigarette companies and have done so frequently. And when I was asked about that 2 weeks ago in court, I said, I'll talk to anybody because the killing's got to stop.
All right, thanks, Mike. So we thought what we would do is begin with like an opening statement of a couple of minutes, just explaining your general philosophy about conflicts in tobacco research for 2 minutes each. So Joanna, let me invite you to do it first.
Okay, and I'll just say, so we've only been given 2 minutes to be able to keep things moving and get to your questions. So I'm going to be brief, but I know a lot of people are here because of the SRMT's recent decision to not allow tobacco industry employees to attend SRMT annual conferences moving forward. And I do applaud that decision. I think this decision and in general, the issues we're talking about today recognizes the extensive scientific evidence on the multitude of ways the tobacco industry uses science for their profit, as well as practice-based evidence on the tactics tobacco companies continue to use to undermine the enactment and the effective implementation of evidence-based tobacco control interventions here and around the world. So these strategies that the tobacco companies use and their use of science in this way work to create doubt about the harms of their products and their practices, and also create doubt about the necessity of policies that would counteract them, as well as they work to promote their own products and practices as solutions, in quotes, to the epidemic that they've created. So tobacco companies employ these strategies to prevent, delay, and dilute evidence-based tobacco control interventions and try to prevent litigation against them and try to maximize the consumption and use of their products. So I think it's appropriate for a scientific society, and I'll say other researchers in general, to not serve to legitimize the tobacco industry as a genuine stakeholder in the creation and use of science. And I also think that as scientists working in a field with life and death consequences, we're always calling upon decision makers to implement evidence-based interventions. So we as a field have ample evidence now about how tobacco companies deliberately and systematically use relationships with researchers and academic institutions to manufacture a false controversy about the impacts of their products and what to do about it. And we should not be hypocritical and not act on that evidence ourselves.
Thanks, Joanna. Mike.
Sure. I'll follow up on the SRMT issue and just read from the basic mission of SRMT, which is to be an open and scientific forum. It states that SRMT is a convener bringing together researchers from multiple countries, from diverse backgrounds across multiple disciplines who represent a diversity of viewpoints on issues of concern to the nicotine and tobacco research community. I don't know in a world where governments now have the requirement under the law to regulate tobacco products. Why censorship in our scientific meetings is good for the scientific and for tobacco control generally. I think I support rigorous science to evaluate smoking harm reduction. I would urge all scientists to push back on inappropriate scientific interpretation of findings that are questionable. And I've seen many of those historically from the industry. And now I've seen some of those coming from some of our colleagues in public health. I really think is more around advocacy than science. I think we should push our scientific journals to do a better job in peer review. I think we need regular evidence reviews in a time when there's uncertainty about these new products. Transparency, openness, accountability in the scientific and regulatory process rather than censorship. So data sharing, analytic method sharing, pre-registration of studies and analytic plans, avoid, full, conflict of interest disclosures, including one's position on the issue of smoking harm reduction when we're writing articles on that topic. And I think we need to be encouraging collaborative scientific research in smoking harm reduction. And hopefully we can get into that discussion of how to make that happen today. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Mike. So just most of you know, but just in case some don't, the Society on Research on Nicotine and Tobacco has announced that they're now banning employees of the tobacco industry from attending SRMT annual meetings. So, and one of the reasons that was stated was that it makes some of the members of SRMT who are not involved uncomfortable. There were some recent posts from Ovid Pomerleau and John Hughes, who were former presidents of SRMT and founders, raising questions about whether that interferes with a mission to stimulate the generation and dissemination of knowledge concerning nicotine and tobacco research. And the idea that research should be presented in a context in which agreement and disagreement can be discussed, and that being part of the scientific process. So Mike, any comments on that?
Well, I agree with the comments I saw from John Hughes, who, by the way, is, saying he's resigning from the organization, which is sad to see, and others who I've heard from as well. I mean, I think SRNT has been a great forum for presenting science. And by the way, some of you may remember, almost a decade, probably 2 decades ago, because I've been around a long time, but I gave one of the keynote speeches years ago. And I think it was when we announced the current policy that SRNT has, where they allowed tobacco industry employees, scientists to present at SRNT, but did not allow them to be voting members or serve on the board of directors. I think that's actually a very reasonable compromise. By the way, I would extend that to the pharmaceutical industry as well, which has for years been major sponsors of our annual meeting at SRNT. And I'm not really sure from the directive that I saw from SRNT, their notice that they put out, what a tobacco product is, what a tobacco, company is. Is it, vaping companies that don't make cigarettes? Is it just cigarette companies? Is it tobacco-free nicotine that we now are addressing in the new line of products that are evolving? It's the worst possible decision I can possibly think of is to keep the science out. I mean, I think we're all adults, we're all scientists. We ought to be able to evaluate the methods that are presented and the merits, and that ought to be the province for judging the science that's out there, the quality that's out there. And in an FDA regulated market like we have in the United States, I mean, we have to realize that the industry, the tobacco companies are required, and they should be long overdue, to convince skeptical FDA regulators with science. They have a responsibility for product stewardship. And, frankly, if they don't follow the rules, they're going to end up in court. And the recent Juul decision is one of the positive things, because unlike cigarettes that got a get out of jail card with some of the legislation from Congress, and I see Neal raising your hand, and I'll just shut up there and let it go on from there. You can ask Joanna.
Neal, can I respond to that?
Yes, yeah, please, John.
And I'll just say, I remember the previous SRMT decision, I'm sure you do too, when the first sort of level of tobacco industry employee policy was set, was that you couldn't be members, right? And there were a lot of members at the time, mostly a lot of basic scientists who were part of the society, who were very upset with that decision. And we've seen, which I think is very sad, a vast reduction in the number of basic scientists who come to SRNT. And I don't know if you all noticed the very small number of presentations at this year's SRNT that fell into the basic science category. So we've been through this before, and I just want to say, remember the days when the tobacco industry said the ceiling will fall down if we ban smoking in restaurants and bars, and it didn't. And then, the next step, this is, sun isn't going to rise the next morning. That's not what happens. And I think I would sort of respectfully say, Mike, that again, we've been through the first step of this policy, and people were upset and people resigned. We kept going. It was a strong 10 years of the society, although it'd be nice to get the basic scientists back. And then, this is a next step. But I'll just tell you a personal experience that I had quickly. I had a pre-conference workshop accepted at the Florence conference in 2017. We had presenters and discussants, and it was a workshop. So we were going to have time for people to work at their tables and brainstorm ideas. But a couple of weeks before the conference, SRNT sent me the list of people who registered for the workshop, and 23% of them were tobacco company employees. So I wasn't comfortable making people sit at the same table as tobacco company employees to brainstorm solutions to the problems that the companies created. And we didn't believe that in that kind of situation, the company employees would be openly sharing their knowledge and ideas about the issues at hand. So we had to modify our plans, nix the audience brainstorming component. So in a sense, there was sort of reverse censorship. We couldn't do what we had planned. And so why do I think in that situation, employees wouldn't openly share all their knowledge and ideas? Well, first, the companies aren't incentivized to share this knowledge openly, and not with their competitors, and not with tobacco control professionals who are working to reduce the use of their products. And then the tobacco company employees who are attending might not have all the information as well to share.
Okay, thanks, Joanna. So we're going to go on and we talked about SRMT. Now I want to ask Joanna, who is an editor at Tobacco Control, about the journal Tobacco Control, about the tobacco industry funded publication policy and rationale. And some specific questions are, does the policy distinguish between traditional tobacco industry and other entities such as independent vape shops, nicotine companies? Does the policy distinguish between current or historical funding? And just Joanna, can you spend a few minutes talking about tobacco control's policy and the rationale on some of these issues?
Great, thanks. Yeah, so I'll try and be quick. And this was a relatively recent policy. It's not just tobacco control. BMJ and other journals also went forward with not allowing tobacco company funded research. So the problem, well, it's not the problem. I mean, science is based on the honor system, that researchers tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And journal reviewers, editors are you and me. So we're not going, if we're not investigative reporters, we're not going to, and we're busy trying to get science published. So we don't have the capacity to check everyone's disclosure, everyone's conflict. So it's completely the honor system. People have to disclose and we accept it. That's part of science. And for the good or the bad, that's what we're dealing with. And that's the situation. So the journal's decision was based on 4 key reasons. I know we're tight, and if we have time, I can go into some of them. But one of the key ones was, again, that the scientific evidence on how tobacco companies use science for their profit and against public health, the public's health, is a big piece. And that evidence has been growing. It grew with the Master Settlement Agreement and the release of millions of internal industry documents. And more research has been done to lay out these strategies. So that was a key piece. Of course, there's also pre-submission bias. So only the research that tobacco companies want to publish will be submitted for publication. And then we can't ignore the scale of the harm of these products. And I think the bottom line is that scientists do not want their journals or their scientific societies to be used in the service of an industry that continues to perpetuate the most deadly disease epidemic of our time. So in terms of the details of the policy, again, it's tobacco funded work, and we have to rely on people to report that and to to follow the policy.
Just to follow up, do you distinguish between someone who's working for Altria versus an independent vape shop owner?
Well, independent vape shop owners don't usually submit research to journals, but I think we would. And I will say that the journal does publish responses to articles from tobacco companies, like including Moira Gilchrist from PMI. So those responses to articles are published online, but it's really the peer-reviewed science that isn't reviewed.
Okay, and then the other thing is historical funding. For example, when I first decided to do research on reduced nicotine content cigarettes, none were available. And Philip Morris provided a gift of research cigarettes, which allowed us for 10 years to do the studies that were sort of the backbone of the current reduced nicotine content cigarettes. So in a sense, I've had tobacco funding. It was not money, but it was products. So how would you deal with that? Can I publish in tobacco control?
Yeah, so we don't just, I'm going to have to, so it's sort of like SRMT's policy, right? There's so many situations that you're going to write a dissertation if you're going to list all the conditions that are and aren't included. And at some point you have the spirit of the policy, and people, it's the spirit of what we're trying to achieve. So at this point, it doesn't specify that if you've received free product, that counts as tobacco industry funding. But I know some researchers are quite uncomfortable even with that. But that's not part of the journal's policy.
Okay, Mike, any comments about tobacco?
Well, I would, policy? Yeah, I would say some of the best science that I'm seeing is actually coming from the industry, and not just the cigarette industry, by the way. I have a hard time distinguishing when I hear some of my colleagues talk about the tobacco industry and they lump, Enjoy or, vaping product only, businesses into, the same category as the historical cigarette companies. But cigarette companies are now publishing their research. I mean, the problem historically was they hid their research. I mean, I've spent the last 25 years studying cigarette company documents, and, they're informative. Their science was quite good. The problem was they weren't sharing it. And we made in public health some strategic errors. Had we known some of the information that the companies concealed, that, we would have gone a different direction. Now we're in a time, I think, in history with the evolution of the nicotine delivery market, with clearly combustible, dangerous products versus an array of lower risk products, where the companies which make these products could be part of the solution. And we need to understand the science, and excluding it and censorship in these journals is a real problem. I mean, a lot of the articles I saw on IQOS in tobacco control, they were interesting, but which version of IQOS were we talking about in those papers and so on? And you really need to get somehow the partnership between the two. And independence is key. Nobody should be stupid about people's skepticism of the industry's history. They own it. People are going to be skeptical, but I think we should evaluate science based on the merits. We should have confidence in our ability to judge it as journal editors. Thanks.
Thanks. Okay, so Mike, this next question I'm going to ask you to start on, which gets back to the harm reduction question. So one of the missions of SRMT was to reduce the harm of tobacco and nicotine containing products. And so at one time, we're dealing only with cigarettes. Now we're dealing with the whole question of harm reduction, which you mentioned. Research involving harm reduction products have got limited funding, limited access to products. There are concerns about tobacco researchers taking funds from anyone who's manufacturing harm reduction products. And then there's also the question of, we like to see independent research. We don't want to see all the harm reduction research coming to the companies. And so how does tobacco funding address, or what can we do as a policy to address the tobacco funding questions for harm reduction research?
It's a great question, Neal. And I know Joanna has written on this years ago, but, and we have some models. We have, the user fees and FDA funding that is going on. That seems like a very reasonable thing that FDA ought to be doing to stimulate independent research. Unfortunately, the cone of silence exists even in that area, where the academic researchers are almost separated from the products that are actually going through PMTA or MRTP review. And I have suggested to the FDA that they allow companies that want to voluntarily contribute funds for research where, academic researchers and commercial academic or commercial vendors that are actually doing a lot of the industry research at this point could compete to do the kind of work, because PMTA applications, FDA's laid out, there's certain kinds of research studies that have to be done. Abuse liability, toxicity studies, human epidemiologic studies, human behavioral studies, perception studies. There's an array of things that companies are now required. Right now, that's separated from like the T-Course centers. And I see what's happening is a disconnect between the science that's getting published in journals like Tobacco Control from the independent scientists from what's actually going to FDA for them to review. And, it's not an easy solution, but if companies could, contribute, and then they could have it go through a peer review, and then there would be conditions to the scientists that they could publish their results without having to hide it, like what happens with industry-funded research, where you sign confidentiality agreements. Some companies would do it, and many might not do it, but at least it's a process to go forward.
Thanks. So Joanna, since you've written about this, what are your thoughts about how we would fund researchers who want to study harm reduction?
Yeah, and I'll just say it's important to think about the US and the FDA and our situation in this part of the world, but there's a whole rest of the world. And the tobacco industry has free reign, in most countries. There's some countries where the government is able to set some expectations and the companies follow the law, but there are many countries where they're just running rampant. So we have to keep that in mind. This is not like, we're not the world. So there's lots of broader context you have to keep in mind. And I do want to agree, I do want to agree with Mike about the lumping problem and, using terminology that isn't clear. And I think, with these new products, since cigarettes, that we have to be careful. But what do we mean by tobacco industry? I completely agree with that. And in the same token, I think we have to be very careful with the terminology of harm reduction, because I think that terminology has been co-opted by tobacco companies. And I recommend that we don't use it anymore when we're talking about ends and heated tobacco products and other tobacco products. Instead, we need to be explicit about what we mean and what we're trying to say. Because I think some people use harm reduction instead of saying e-cigarettes. So it's just, they're using it as a synonym. And some people are using it deliberately to try to put a positive spin on tobacco companies' nicotine maintenance strategy, which is what we're talking about, right? Like, I think when many people talk about harm reduction, we're saying quit cigarettes, but stay on another nicotine product. So I think we have to be very careful, because the concept of harm reduction used by tobacco companies has always been a fraud designed to maximize their products. And we've seen it with filters, low tar cigarettes, et cetera. So we have to be careful with our terminology. So in the link in the chat, you have a list of some papers that might be helpful. And one of them came out of a meeting that I helped organize just prior to the 2007 SRNT meeting in Austin. And we had a convening to discuss the question, is there a way that tobacco industry money could be used to sponsor research that would be acceptable to the tobacco control community? And Mike and Neal were at that convening, and we came out with a paper that evaluated various funding models. And basically the analysis found that we thought, the authors of the paper felt that investing a proportion of tobacco taxes in research is a good way to go. And I know the state of California does that with their TRDRP program. Mandated court orders of tobacco company user fees or taxes or levies that are required by courts and governments also minimize conflicts of interest. And I think there are ways that tobacco companies can pay into a fully independent third party that administers the funds, but unfortunately, the latest experiment with that is not an example of being fully independent. So I suggest, take a look at the citations, and I really liked some that Mike added to the list as well. So it's a good list of papers.
Thanks. So the next question is for you, Joanna. So some university departments or research centers accept grants from industry or industry foundations or advocacy organizations to carry out the research. Some institutions like yours, for example, Bloomberg, is funded by a sponsor who has expressed sort of skepticism about electronic cigarettes. And so the question is, when should researchers declare conflicts of interest when their institutions have accepted funding either from industry or from public health groups that have specific points of view about tobacco, harm reduction especially?
Okay, let's not say harm reduction.
Okay, or tobacco.
No, that's okay. Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's really challenging. I know research is being done on how to deal with disclosures. And so there's our personal disclosures. And I do think, I do agree with Mike that sometimes that sort of putting forward our position on issues is helpful. There's, we don't control our own institutions of what they do and decide and who they take money from. We don't control that. So and we might be influenced more by other groups that we interact with than our own necessarily employers. So it gets really challenging. And I think more work needs to be done to really think through how to deal with this best in science. So you're saying that there's not a lot of money. How do we increase funding for, alternate non-cigarette nicotine products? But there's even less research money for things like this, disclosure, conflicts of interest. How do we deal with that? Like, it's really hard to get funding for those sorts of things. I think, hopefully we can talk about peer review too, but with regarding disclosures, we just have to be cognizant that it is problematic. And so what's being asked for often by journals is not comprehensive. And then sometimes journals don't even follow their own policies about conflicts when they receive the disclosure. So, some journals, as many of you know, ask about conflicts just related to the paper that you're submitting and not about, the past 5 or 10 years. And then we know that some authors, don't disclose the whole truth. So, there's recently a paper published where authors that were funded by the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, which is fully funded by Philip Morris International, disclosed that they had funding from the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, but didn't say that all of that funding comes from Philip Morris International. So, it's not really the whole truth. So again, this is where it's real. Science is so much an honor system. And again, journals, reviewers can't be expected to investigate and cross-check each author's disclosure statement. So I think this is an area that we have to do a lot more thinking about. What's feasible, what's effective, what information do people need? I don't have all the answers for at this point.
I would just comment on the disclosure. I think it's complex how to do it, and different journals and different places have different, requirements and so on. I'm less concerned about the disclosure issue than the science and the merits of the science that is presented in the research that we're looking at. And I'd like to hear Joanna comment on some of the, when scientists are publishing stuff and their conclusions don't match with their data. And in fact, some of the papers get retracted. Shouldn't you call out those folks? Because, it doesn't matter whether you're in industry or academic environments. That's dishonesty. And I don't think we can allow that, particularly in an area like this whole issue of smoking alternative nicotine products and whether they're good or bad. And we're trying to figure it out in a time of uncertainty when we allow people's advocacy positions to literally write the conclusions. And sometimes, and what happened, and I'm a historian of the industry's misrepresentation. This is what I testified to in court, in the cigarette companies. And it wasn't so much the science that they funded being good or bad. In fact, I had 10 Nobel Prize winners I'm reminded of every time I go to court. It was the fact that they lied about the evidence and whether it, was truthful. And they spun the science and said there was doubt when there wasn't really doubt about the link between cigarettes and smoking at the time. And that was dishonest. And so I see the same kind of dishonesty, frankly, happening in the area of smoking harm reduction. And we're not calling out our colleagues who are polluting the scientists. I'll call out Stan Glanz. He's had papers rejected or retracted. The COVID and vaping issue I wrote to the journal editor there, asked to retract the paper because the conclusions that I heard being written in their press statements and interviews that they did on television where they said it was a causal relationship, they backtracked on that because the evidence wasn't there. Now, is it a mistake or is that deliberate? And if it's deliberate, those people shouldn't be publishing anywhere.
Can I just speak to peer review quickly?
Sure.
Okay.
Well, actually, I was going to ask another question about peer review. So
Okay.
I would just ask the next question. So it's like a two-part question. So in the 2016 Surgeon General's report on e-cigarettes, they invited reviewers that were opposed to cigarette harm reduction, such as tobacco-free kids, but not from groups supportive of harm reduction. So the question is, should advocacy groups be not invited to participate in such kind of review? Second thing, which is related to the peer review process, is on conflict. Should you accept a referee request for a paper if you have another paper or grant application under review that could be viewed as competition with the paper that you were asked to review? So I'd like to just get into the whole conflicts in the manuscript review process. So Joanna, you can start with this.
Okay, I'll try and be quick, but I just want to start with peer review in general. So I think all of you who have acted as journal editors know that peer review definitely results in a much stronger paper, but it's far from like a stamp of 100% guaranteed. And so it's not unusual to get 3 reviews where one reviewer recommends accept, one recommends major revision, and one recommends reject, all reading the same paper. And I think the quality of the review depends, partly on the specific expertise of the reviewer and whether they're able to pick up on the nuances. And I think it's really important as journal editors, sort of speaking to your point, Neal, is that especially for these papers on non-cigarette nicotine delivery systems, that you get, like, I consciously try and get people who are going to present or represent a range of views, because you want the most critical people to look at a paper and see what the issues are. So it's always important to do that. So, there are very, very few reviewers who look at the references that authors cite to confirm that they're being used appropriately. Some people do, but it's a very small minority. And while peer reviewers can pick up blatant errors in tables and figures, it's often very difficult to identify specific errors or some systematic errors. And especially, we're talking about papers that are about 3,500 words or so. So only so much detail can be provided in the methods. And also, all of you know that each year, we are all getting busier and busier. The number of journals has proliferated. And that means that it's harder for journals to get reviewers to say yes. All of us are tapped to do reviews regularly. And reviewers likely are spending less time doing their review just because we have so much on our plate. So there are a lot of challenges. So I think just saying peer review will pick up problems it's just have open science and peer review will take care of the issues, I think is a little misguided. And I think the same thing is that, at a conference, how can someone assess good science from bad science in a 15-minute presentation at a conference? I think this thinking is flawed. And so we have to be aware of what peer review can and can't do. So it can improve work, but it's not going to be a 100% guaranteed stamp. But I think it's really important to have a range of views, especially when you know that you want people who can be the most critical of a paper or a report to do the review. I think that helps make it stronger.
So I think I agree. And I think, Joanne, you're making the argument that censorship is not the way to go. We want more information. We want more contributors. And as an academic editor, it is a frustrating process. And I can see how editors, it's not like you just get 3 reviewers and you assume that they're all equal. I mean, academic editors, unfortunately, have their own biases, and they steer articles that tend to reinforce their biases to those reviewers. So there has to be oversight. But in the end, having things open, I think, is better, because the truth is what we are seeking, and reliability in the findings in scientific journals. And I have found in the field of the alternative nicotine area, it's complex. I mean, these products are complex, how they're evolving and changing, how they're used. This is, it's not as simple as it used to be. And I have found actually having to reach out to people who have expertise, including people in the industry, to do reviews of articles, and they've improved things. So I don't see it as a negative. And I just think this censorship we're seeing in scientific journals, scientific forums like SRMT is the wrong way to go. We ought to be opening up and really demanding more of our academic editors, of the journals, and I think getting into some of the things I was talking about, transparency and openness of data sharing of analytic plans, pre-registration of analytic plans, and so on, are ways that are not perfect. There's no guarantee. But it will improve the quality of the science. And for tobacco control, I did a talk, say, the eroding trust in tobacco control, because we are built on a foundation of Surgeon General's reports, which were based on trust, the public's trust that they got a comprehensive review of the evidence. Sometimes that evidence was limited because it was concealed by the industry. We made mistakes along the way and have had to correct them. But, that's what the public, is depending on, publications like Surgeon General's reports to provide us with the best evidence that's out there. And that's, as scientific researchers, what we ought to be striving for.
All right, thanks. So, getting near the end. So what I'd like to do, we have a lot of questions from the attendees. Thank you. I will only have time to address a few of them. So I've picked a few. One was the question of if academic researchers receive criticism on their research or comments from tobacco industry employee or tobacco industry researcher, would that criticism be accepted? And if not, why not? Joanna, and comments about that. We're talking about interchange. And so,
oh, yeah, of course. I mean, of course, we need to be open to all comments and criticisms. So would you accept? Yeah, just like with any feedback, you would listen to it and judge if you think there's merit and make improvements if you think they're warranted. I think one of the challenges now, just one more strategy that the tobacco industry is using to use science, not generate science, but use science for its own gain and not for the public's health, is going after articles as much as they can. And they're targeting certain people and writing, not just like what some of us would do, like Mike, what you might have done is, like 1,000 words of, these are the points that I take issue with in your article, but pages and pages of clearly lawyer review documents, going after papers. And this is what the tobacco industry, did with their freedom of information requests to shut down governments from doing their work and moving forward on tobacco, evidence-based tobacco control policies, had to slow down because they have to respond to all of this, requests for information. So you have to be like, there's a point where, yes, as scientists, we want the criticism, but when it starts to become a strategy to take up an inordinate amount of time and editors' times, authors' times, which is what we're seeing now, there definitely has to be a balance. And I think they've crossed the line where this is now sort of a strategy to try to keep people from doing their work, silencing folks, et cetera. So just another sort of a tool in their toolbox to influence science.
Thanks. So there's a question. Several people have asked this, and you just brought this up, and I think this is important, is the definition of the tobacco industry. So, it is enjoy the tobacco industry, for example, or, someone is an independent manufacturer of an oral nicotine product. Are they the tobacco industry? Because, a lot of our language has been the tobacco industry has done these things, and how do we figure out what's the tobacco industry? Mike, why don't you start with this one?
Sure, I'll give you a simple definition. You can go to the Department of Justice. Judge Kessler defines the tobacco industry in her, findings, and that was the major cigarette producers, and I think they've now been slimmed down to just a handful of them originally. And that's what I define as the tobacco industry historically. And so enjoy, no. Independent, vape shops or, manufacturers of e-liquids, no. Even non-cigarette producing, that weren't part of that litigation. Frankly, they weren't part of a conspiracy to deceive. Now, there are a lot of industries out there. We all ought to be skeptical of any industry and what they will say, because they're going to do things to their advantage. That's what they're in business to do, to make money. And nobody should be, just trusting of what we see of anyone. Science ought to be judged on its merits, period. And I think the more science is open, the better off we're going to be. But I think definitions really do matter, and they're really confused in this field in tobacco control. And I think deliberately so, because it's almost like a prohibitionist against all tobacco products. And I just don't think that's realistic.
Okay, so Joanna, what are your thoughts about this? And how does the journal Tobacco Control define tobacco industry?
I don't know how but I agree with Mike. I think we have to be careful, and I would certainly put in the cigarette manufacturers and companies they have stakes in, so or are funding, right? So Juul would be considered tobacco industry because of Altria's stake in it. Foundation for a Smoke-Free World would be considered tobacco industry. They're funded by Philip Morris International. So, but I agree, there are different definitions for different purposes too, but when we're talking about conflicts of interest, I think, having some clear, I think it'd be helpful to have some sort of clear writing and thoughts about what's included and why.
But I think people, sort of know when you're making a product that you have a stake in it, and you're going to have a bias just because of that, whether you're a pharma company or a cigarette maker or an e-cigarette company and so on. But, there are foundations out there like Bloomberg that are on the record, basically saying that vaping products ought to be prohibited. And they pushed out a lot of terrible, science, actually. They keep, repeating some things that are just not true. I think that's wrong as well. And, I'm not saying that to you, Joanna, because, I think everybody, as a scientist, you've got to stand on whatever your merits are. But I just think the issue around conflict of interest is complicated. And there are biases that we should just recognize that are out there. And how do we, as scientists, which is really back to the SRMT, a scientific forum to exchange ideas, I think it's going backwards when we start just censoring the science that's going to be available. How you control voting memberships, given the terrible history and the biases that are inherent, I think it's always going to be a tension in every scientific organization. It isn't tobacco. It probably is around climate change and food industry, and you could go through the list. But how do we advance public health is really the question.
Yeah, so I think almost out of time, but then we just pursue this. This is so important. Like University of California prohibits or have policies against taking support from tobacco companies, which include anything involving nicotine products. And it makes sense that if you're looking at a harm reduction product that's not related to a tobacco company, that be excluded. Who is the body who would make that decision that would be acceptable by universities around the country, for example? Any ideas how that would occur? Joanna, any thoughts?
It's like herding cats. I mean, I actually think that universities have lost their way a bit and have become much more business oriented than feeling like they're there to serve the public's interest. And I think part of the sort of anti-science sentiment that we've seen that Mike marched for, and his sign is behind it, the anti-science sentiment is partly because universities are also, influenced by donors, grants, having a business mentality rather than being there to serve the public and make necessarily, make the world a better place and work towards that. So I think it's challenging. I don't think that, there are bodies, but I don't think there'd be one. There can be, okay. I think that'd be challenging.
So Mike, any suggestions from you before we wrap up?
Sure. I mean, I think you do have to have clear definitions. And I think, the issue of conflict of interest is complicated, not so much that you can list the conflicts and disclose. It's then what happens, like banning folks from talking to each other. And I just think in this day and age where we have a revolution of new products to potentially reduce disease and premature death from smoking, we should be opening the doors rather than shutting them. And to me, censorship is not science. It's the opposite of that. So that's my opinion.
Thanks. So I think we have to wrap up now. So I want to thank Joanna and Mike for a great discussion. Super timely and great points. I apologize to the 32 people who raised questions in chats that we didn't have time to get to. Send it back to Justin to close up.
All right, thanks. We are out of time. Thank you, Drs. Benowitz, Cohen, and Cummings for the excellent discussion. And finally, thank you to the audience of 220 people for your participation. Thanks again for participating and have a top-notch weekend.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.